Hello and welcome into the GSMC Sports Podcast brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, TJ Mabardi. We are coming to you live on Wednesday afternoon. Today is July 3rd, so happy 4th of July Eve. And today we are going to be continuing on some topics surrounding the NBA free agency and everything that is going on. And we are going to look at it through the perspective of which teams have the best chance to take down the Boston Celtics, who have basically brought back just about everybody on their roster, it seems like, outside of O'Shea Brissett. The Celtics are going to be able to return just about everybody. And because of that reason, it is basically on the rest of the league to try and up their game to be able to match the Celtics. So I'm going to be giving my top 10 threats to the Celtics in the NBA next season. Then from there, we're going to dive into a couple of Eastern Conference teams that could be top contenders with the Celtics next year, with the Milwaukee Bucks and their lack of moves, as well as the Cleveland Cavaliers, who actually were just able to lock down Donovan Mitchell on a new contract extension. So we're going to be touching on both of those topics, and then we're going to be looking at a little bit of a different gear, some younger teams in the Chicago Bulls and the Houston Rockets in terms of some of the reporting that has gone around those franchises and what direction they are headed in. And I'll be giving my thoughts on where both of these teams should be looking to going in the coming years. But before we get into everything, just a reminder to like, follow, subscribe wherever you keep up with us. To any of our viewers, be sure to use the comment section to give us your thoughts on all of the latest happenings in sports. And if you could check us out on social media as well. You can leave a tip or donation at the link that is streaming across the bottom ticker, gsmcpodcast.net. Anything would be greatly appreciated there. Diving into this top 10 list, though, of the biggest threats to the Boston Celtics next year, because we know that after, whether you want to give the Celtics credit for their playoff path and their accomplishments as a team, whether or not they are all-time status, it was a dominant season for the Celtics last year, but it does feel like they aren't necessarily untouchable. So we're going to be looking at all of the teams that have the best chances to try and dethrone the Celtics next year. Number 10, I have the Dallas Mavericks. Now, there's definitely going to be a little bit of a theme in this list that teams in the Eastern Conference, just based off of the playoff format, are going to be a bigger threat to the Celtics than those in the West. So I wanted to include the Dallas Mavericks, who of course the Celtics had to defeat in order to win the 2024 NBA championship. But I do think that the Celtics are just a better team than the Mavericks. They were last year, even with some of the moves that the Mavericks have made so far early in free agency. I still feel that way. So I think that they are in consideration, as they will be, for just winning the finals outright, aside from the Boston Celtics. But again, being in the Western Conference, being that they have a lot of teams they have to worry about themselves to get through, and then ultimately, I just don't know if they are a mismatch for Boston, so I have them coming in at number 10. Number 9, I have the Orlando Magic, and I really wanted to have them higher on this list. I'm just a fan of the Magic. I think it's just the youth movement. Being a mid to small market team, I'm just sort of rooting for them to be able to overcome some of the odds that are stacked against them the way that the NBA is run. And I'm a very big fan of Paolo Banchero, and not just him, but a lot of the young talent that they have in Orlando. And then they signed Kentavious Caldwell-Pope this offseason to a new contract. I think he fits in great. I know that a lot of people are down on the move, but I like the decision for them to draft Tristan da Silva with the, I believe it was 18th overall pick, to provide some spacing there as well. And the Magic are a team that ultimately, when I had to take a step back, the chances that they were going to defeat the Celtics in a potential playoff series. The Magic still need to have their sort of emergence into the playoffs. They at least made it last year, pushed the Cavaliers to 7, but I think they are probably one more sort of run into the playoffs is what they need before they're able to be put in any world next to the top contenders in the league. And so ultimately, given all that, I put them at 9th, but I do feel like the Magic on any given night can be one of the toughest matchups for the Celtics based off of their defense and their switchability on that end of the floor as well. You just also know when it comes to the Magic, there is a lot to be proven in terms of the reliability of their offense, so that's ultimately why I have them as low as they are. Number 8, I have the Cleveland Cavaliers. So, yes, they just went out and re-signed Donovan Mitchell to a new contract extension, and the Cavaliers are feeling good about themselves, but I still have my doubts in terms of what the identity of this team is. Obviously, it runs through Donovan Mitchell, but what are they going to be excellent at? And I just don't know if there is, one blanket statement of they are really good at this. They're a really talented roster is kind of what I see them as, but I just don't know about the fits with one another. So I have them lower than I was really expecting to in this list as well, because number 7, right above them, I have the Indiana Pacers. Because I at least feel better about knowing what the Pacers are going to bring on a night-to-night basis in terms of a fast pace that is able to catch older or less athletic teams off guard, an elite offense, and I just think that that's something the Pacers could at least lean on, that they would pose a different type of threat to the Celtics than a lot of these other teams, including the Cleveland Cavaliers, probably could. And granted, the Cavs won a game against the Celtics last year, and that was even with Donovan Mitchell missing a couple games, but I still think that the Pacers ultimately played them tougher on a consistent basis, even when they did lose Tyrese Halliburton for those last 2 games. So really, this 10 through 7 stretch here I view as more of the long shots, but teams that do deserve recognition for being very talented and could provide tough outs to the Celtics. Now, I have a little bit of a different tier here for these next 2 teams, which is good competition, but in the Western Conference, so not exactly in the way of the Boston Celtics. Number 6, I have the Oklahoma City Thunder, where a lot of people have made the comparisons of the Thunder being a little bit of a younger version of the Celtics, being led by your one main star and then having just a ton of positional flexibility, defensive versatility around them. Everybody can shoot. They can play a 5-out type of game. Now, the Thunder needed to at least have that wrinkle for when you need to go a little bit bigger. What is their option? They just signed Isaiah Hartenstein to a 3-year deal in free agency this past year, which if these 2 teams were ever going to match up, I know that Chet Holmgren is a very talented defender, but I think he has a little bit of developing still to do on that side before he is a true defensive anchor. And it's not like Hartenstein is going to be in the running for Defensive Player of the Year, but he's at least a wild card that the Thunder can throw out there. And I do like the fit of how he also can sort of get things done with the ball in his hands, just like the other top 8 players, it feels like, on this OKC roster. So you have to feel good about them. Number 5, sort of same deal. The Minnesota Timberwolves would absolutely be higher if the Celtics were going to have to face either one of these teams before making it to the finals, but they're in the other conference, so they're not quite as big of challengers, but another would be an incredible finals series. I think either one of these, if they were to take place, the Anthony Edwards versus Jason Tatum. I know that it's a little bit weird to say, because I wouldn't say it's a rivalry, but we have all these conversations about who's going to be the next face of the league. A lot of people were sort of getting down to Anthony Edwards or Jason Tatum. Now, Tatum's now 26 and Edwards is 22. So again, I don't think it's a perfect comparison, but they're both in the conversation. And I think that the Timberwolves got better this offseason as well. So they're going to be a team that is able to play big and try and overwhelm the Celtics a little bit with size more than the Mavericks were able to do in the finals, where Kristaps Porzingis was injured for most of the series, that is, and Jason Tatum was able to get away with guarding the fives on the other team. I think that the Timberwolves with Karl Anthony Towns could make them pay a little bit more, but again, in the Western Conference, so that's why they fall outside of this top group. Now, moving on to these next couple teams here, I would say that the Celtics would definitely be favored, but could be a close Eastern Conference Finals series. Number 4, I have the Milwaukee Bucks. And the Bucks are a team that we're going to be talking about shortly here in the show that, yes, their offseason has been a little bit underwhelming, but I'm still not ready to fully turn the page on a team led by a top 2 player in the league when healthy in Giannis Antetokounmpo. And I know that I believe that Giannis is going to be healthy from here on out. Now, obviously, the body type with him, you do have to have some level of concern, but I think he's going to be all right, and I believe that the connection between him and Damian Lillard is only going to be better next year. The reason why I have the Bucks as low as I do is because of the fact that I think that with the current Bucks defense, and maybe it's going to get better in year 2 under Doc Rivers, we saw some flashes of improvement there, but with this defense, the Bucks would basically need to out-offense the Celtics for an entirety of a series, and I just don't know if there are the same number of reliable scorers on Milwaukee. Now, they maybe have the upper echelon of Damian Lillard and Giannis. Dame obviously needs to prove himself to show that he is still in that tier, but I don't think he's far off. Again, we're going to dive a little bit more into the Bucks in the next segment. So I'll leave it at there for now, but I do have the Bucks as the number 4 threat and the number 3 team to rival the Celtics next year out of the Eastern Conference. Number 3, I have the Philadelphia 76ers. I was bouncing back and forth a little bit between Philly and Milwaukee, but ultimately, I think that the 76ers, at least you can feel like, I feel like with them, there is some level of trust somewhat deeper here, and Joel Embiid is obviously an entire mismatch problem of his own. Now, I do frankly feel all right about the Celtics' ability to guard Embiid, considering the fact that, especially, maybe it was just the injuries last year that he was dealing with, but I've still never felt like Embiid is elite out of passing out of these double teams, and he's going to be able to score one-on-one against just about anybody in the NBA. But in terms of how that sort of play style translates to the playoffs, I just don't believe we've seen it yet. Celtics have had their way with Philly and Embiid for the majority of these years, so I am going to put them at number 3. And then the top 2 teams here are the ones that I consider to be the true threats. Number 2 is the Denver Nuggets. They would be number 1 if they were in the Eastern Conference. I know a lot of people are sort of souring on the Nuggets because of the fact that they let KCP walk. Their ownership group doesn't seem super committed to investing all this money into the franchise, which is absolutely a concern. But when I look at the Nuggets, I look at them having the number 1 mismatch for the Celtics in the entire NBA. And you're looking at them if you're watching us on screen here. This is Nikola Jokic, and the fact that there is just no answers that the Celtics have for Jokic. We saw that in their regular season games this past year, and I'm not really sure what the answer is. Now, you get to a 7-game series we did see the Celtics have an ability to be pretty diverse with their defensive strategies, using Tatum to guard bigs in both the Cleveland series, sometimes in the Indiana series, and for the majority of the Dallas series in the finals. So maybe they would try and do something like that of Tatum or Brown on Jokic and then having Porzingis as a help defender. I don't know. I think that that's something that probably don't have to worry about entirely until a playoff series were to come, but I think it would take multiple games for the Celtics to even come up with some strategy to be able to slow this down, and by the time they do, it might be too late. So that is the Nuggets at number 2, and then number 1 is the New York Knicks. And listen, I'm not one who typically buys into the offseason buzz of these big market teams when the media is sort of throwing parades for winning the offseason, but I do believe that the Knicks are the second best team in the Eastern Conference behind the Celtics, and their ability to go out and get Mikal Bridges is going to be, I think, a really fun defense to watch next year, and they were this past season as well, but just adding that much more versatility on the wings. You can, obviously in the NBA it's all about switches and such, and we see that time and time again. Obviously with the Knicks, they don't necessarily have a big man who can switch out onto the perimeter consistently like that, so we'll see about that. But you would think that for the most part the Knicks are going to be able to guard Jaylen Brown and Jason Tatum with Mikal Bridges and OG Anunoby, two of the best defensive forwards in the league. And that would be a really fun chess match to watch, in my opinion. We saw the Celtics take on a little bit more of a defensive identity during the NBA Finals against the Mavericks. Maybe this would end up turning into a slugfest between Boston and New York, but I would definitely, and obviously for all of the outside factors as well, being New York versus Boston would just be so much fun. So it's something that I am definitely hoping takes place next year in the playoffs, but we'll have to wait to find out. Now, of course, we are recording this in early July, so there are still a ton of moves set to take place until then that could impact this ranking, but never too early, right? After all of the initial buzz of the offseason. But one team that has been sort of absent from that type of offseason attention and excitement is the Milwaukee Bucks, who have been largely silent so far in this offseason, from their draft selections being a little bit underwhelming in terms of championship contention next year to their free agency moves or lack thereof. So we are going to be diving into whether or not it is a concern for the Bucks heading into next season. But before we do, we have to take a quick break. Don't go anywhere. We will be right back.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the face shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the news, if it's some moosey shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip, you choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift. Oh, I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast. We just talked about the biggest threats in the NBA for the reigning champion Boston Celtics. And one of the teams that immediately comes to mind when you ask that question is the Milwaukee Bucks. And I still do feel like that is the case, but early on so far in this offseason, it has been very quiet for Milwaukee. And it's not really instilling a ton of confidence in a Bucks fan base that has seen back-to-back first-round exits the past couple of years. Now, obviously, injuries are the number one reason for that being the case. Missing Giannis for the entirety of last year's playoff series, mixed in with some Damian Lillard injuries as well. And then in 2023, Giannis missing over half of their first-round series against Miami. So I don't want to make it seem like the Bucks are any type of failure because they haven't made it back to, the finals or conference finals in these past handful of years. They have been very unlucky, which you can absolutely acknowledge, and then acknowledge the fact that this offseason, where it does seem like there is some level of pressure on the Bucks, they haven't done anything to really impact the season outlook for the year to come. Now, again, a lot of people were ready to just entirely write off the Bucks last season. I was never really on board with that. The Bucks were going to be a 2 seed in the East. They were beating up on the Celtics in a game in early April to win their 48th game when Giannis went down with that calf strain. And again, the fact that they had only won 48 games up to that point did feel like a little bit of a letdown, but we also, in the beginning of the season, were talking about the fact that the Bucks were really good under Adrian Griffin and that they didn't play a style of basketball specifically on the defensive end that was going to be successful in the postseason. So I don't think their year should be judged on wins and losses because of the fact that even when they were winning, it still didn't feel like it was enough there. So I defend the Bucks more than the average person does, I feel like, to some degree on that note. I don't think the Bucks were ever going to beat the Celtics in a playoff series, but I think they could have beat just about everybody else. And I'm not saying they would have, but they definitely could have. And instead, they end up getting eliminated in the first round by Indiana because they're dealing with all of these injuries. And now, again, the excitement level does feel pretty low for Milwaukee. Now, that being said, we're headed into year 2 of Giannis and Lillard, and it wasn't quite as dominant last season as we were maybe expecting it to be, but at the same time, it does take a lot of adjustment here when you're talking about pairing up two players who for their entire careers have been, Giannis obviously took some developmental years, but once he was actually arrived, there was no looking back. He was the undisputed number one. And, I think that it also gets a little bit more complicated the deeper you dive into this specific situation with Milwaukee. There's, of course, the story that Doc Rivers told on the Bill Simmons podcast about how Damian Lillard came into the season out of shape because he was worried about getting injured before being traded and such. And I do feel like we saw some of the repercussions of that. The fact that he would be great, twice a week, but he would have some pretty mediocre games in that stretch as well. Again, I think the consistency of playing week in, week out, every day did sort of catch up to him a little bit. So he should be back to being a conditioned version of himself next year, and that alone is going to be a difference maker. But also, outside of that alone, Lillard spent 11 years of his career being the number one option for the Trailblazers, and then he had to sort of adjust to being the second option just like that on the fly with very little training camp. I think that Lillard actually got traded just before training camp, but it was pretty late into the summer that took place, and ultimately, he wasn't at his peak version of himself, which also kind of hurts the chemistry that him and Giannis were able to build up. And like I said, these things don't happen overnight. We just saw Luka and Kyrie make a run to the finals based off of, for the most part, just the stellar play of the two of them. You give more credit to Luka, but you understand where I'm coming from. He couldn't have done it without Kyrie Irving and some of his performances along the way. And they were a sub 500 team together when Kyrie was traded to Dallas during the second half of the 2023 regular season. Now, smaller sample size there, but again, you get the point. It's not like we're playing NBA 2K on franchise mode and just putting players next to one another and expecting them to both shine. That these things sometimes take time, and that's something that I'm putting a lot of stock into this upcoming season with Lillard and Giannis. And I was feeling even better about the Bucks until this offseason sort of played out. Now, I'm not going to let it entirely diminish all of this praising of the Bucks core that have sort of been, spewing out here, but during the draft, they took two 19-year-olds in A.J. Johnson and Tyler Smith, where the likelihood of either one of them getting any type of significant minutes is just about 0%, especially on a team that's coached by Doc Rivers, who showed last season he had very little interest in developing youth talent at this point in his career and at this point in the stage of the Milwaukee Bucks, where they think that they are championship contenders, at least from the perspective of giving them actual meaningful minutes. But, sometimes those late firsts, early seconds in the NBA draft can be a little bit overrated. Obviously, as basketball fans, we all get excited about the what ifs, and just about every prospect has some sort of, well, what if this plays out? And you can talk yourself into just about anybody, but I do think that there were legitimately guys that could have gotten playing time and not just been another one of these people we get hooked on for a couple weeks and then a couple years from now we end up forgetting about them. I thought there were a couple of options for them. Ryan Dunn out of Virginia, definitely flawed offensively, and that would have been a tough fit, especially next to Giannis maybe, in terms of the spacing of the fit there, but still would probably be the second best defender on the Bucks, just on their roster entirely by the end of the regular season. So that's somebody I would have liked to see them go after. You can make a case as well for Terrence Shannon Jr. out of Illinois, Baylor Shireman out of Creighton, or Kyle Filipowski out of Duke. Any one of them I think could have gotten 10 minutes a game maybe, at least in the regular season, and seen if it was going to translate to the playoffs. And I understand that the majority of the time when you're looking at picks number 23 and 33 is what the Bucks held this past draft season, they typically don't pan out the majority of the time. But especially with their cap situation, they are likely going to be a second apron luxury tax team next year. I just feel like it would have been worth them at least trying to take some swings at potential rotational players, and instead we have very little idea. And you know what? If either one of them, specifically Tyler Smith, were drafted by a younger team where it feels like there isn't this win now timeline at hand, then I would like the picks a lot. It's not like I dislike the prospects. I just don't like the fit in terms of where the Bucks are currently at and what I wish they would have done with those selections. And that's just the draft. Again, we're talking about young players that typically don't have these massive impacts when the playoffs come around. But then in free agency, we've seen the only move they made was to pick up DeLon Wright, who, by the way, I do like, and I feel like, last year he was a midseason pickup for the Heat, and he was largely not impactful for the most part. I'd like to think that with a full training camp with the Bucks, that he could turn into a legitimate backup point guard option. I mean, DeLon Wright was all right. He had that hot shooting streak at one point in one of those games against the Celtics in the first round. So, I don't know. We'll see on DeLon Wright. But there's not very much motion happening here. And to be fair, they were pretty limited financially to even have that be the case in the first place, where they are already talking about $183 million that is currently committed to 10 players, and they're going to have to round out their roster as well on, veteran minimum deals. But I don't know if that's probably going to end up reaching over 189 million, which will be that second luxury tax cap. So it's definitely a tough position for the Bucks to be in. They have some rotational players from last year that they have to make decisions on, and Jay Crowder, Malik Beasley, Patrick Beverley. I feel like I'd probably like to see them go after Beverley just because of the defense. Defense is still one of my bigger concerns with this team, especially along the perimeter. I feel like the Jay Crowder took over in large part some of these bigger minutes when Doc Rivers became the head coach, and it sort of bumped Andre Jackson Jr. out of the rotation. But I would like to see Rivers try and incorporate him a little bit more, because I feel like he can be an important piece specifically from the defensive end on the perimeter from a wing that is going to be important to knock out the Celtics, the Knicks, and you can maybe even throw the 76ers in that conversation as well. But, again, not a lot of options for them. They can try and pull off a Brook Lopez or Chris Middleton deal maybe to dump off some expensive contracts. It would probably be Lopez, who has been in a number of different trade rumors. Giannis doesn't want to be a full-time starting center, so you'd have to find a replacement for him that is going to take a veteran minimum deal and not be a liability there. So I don't know. Ultimately, I'm not going to rule out the Bucks next year, but I see a lot of concerns. And again, Giannis is good enough, and as long as Dame is good enough too, this is going to be a team that's going to have home court advantage in the postseason. And the majority of the time we do see typically the team with the best player ends up winning in the NBA. So again, can't rule out Giannis and the Bucks, but I have my share of concerns. And I also have my share of concerns for another team in the Eastern Conference that had home court advantage in the postseason last year, and that is the Cleveland Cavaliers, where it seems like they are continuing to just move ahead with, we understand we have all of this talent on the roster right now. We're going to find a way to figure it out. And that has been the sentiment from the Cavaliers ownership group and their front office, and that was further solidified by them re-signing Donovan Mitchell to a max contract extension. So we're going to be diving into that deal, what it actually means, some underlying things to take a look at in that contract negotiation process, and whether or not the Cavaliers are going to be true threats next season. But we are going to have to take a quick break before we get into all of that. Don't go anywhere. We will be right back.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast. As so far in the show, we've been breaking down, especially looking at the Eastern Conference of the NBA and how that picture is shaping up to look next year. And we got some additional details surrounding one of the teams in the mix, the Cleveland Cavaliers, where they signed Donovan Mitchell to a max contract extension. It's a 3-year deal worth $150.3 million. It's guaranteed for the next 2 seasons, and then he is going to have a player option in just a few summers in 2000 ahead of the 2027-28 season. So, first off, I'm really glad the Cavs were able to pull this off. Literally from the moment that they traded for Donovan Mitchell a couple years ago, the national media was trying to drive a little bit of a wedge there and draw out how he's going to make it to a bigger market like the Knicks or the Lakers or even the Miami Heat. And ultimately the Cavs were able to convince, at least for the time being, Mitchell to re-up with them. And as much as it is nice, and I want to congratulate the Cavaliers, I wouldn't get too... I would just take a step back and also acknowledge what the details of this contract are. Because he was already under contract for next season, and for 2024-25, he was already under contract. So they reworked the money on that year. He had a player option for 2025-26 that he was largely expected to decline, so that becomes fully guaranteed, but basically just pushes that option back one more year. So he's probably going to decline that deal because of the fact that he will then have 10 years of playing experience and will be eligible for a 5-year max extension worth $380 million for something like $76 million a year. And that's just a no-brainer that he is going to take that. So really, this contract extension only guarantees 1 extra year on his deal, which you'll take if you're the Cavaliers, especially from the perspective of, you know, they really genuinely do feel like they have something with this core that they just haven't been able to figure out just yet. And that is where they're going to be under, again, kind of this same sort of spotlight for the upcoming year, where he's going to play out this upcoming season. The Cavaliers are going to hope to compete, but then we're going to be sitting there in the 2025 offseason ahead of the season and be asking a lot of the similar questions in terms of, are they going to keep running it back with this team, or are they going to look to trade him before next offseason when he declines his player option and ultimately could walk? Now, again, that's looking a little bit ahead at this point. I do just point all of this out because this doesn't fully close the book on, are there issues with Donovan Mitchell, Darius Garland, and the current construction of this roster? Those questions are going to continue to be significant as we move forward here. But ultimately, you know, again, I'm not trying to be too negative on the Cavs there. Again, congrats to them for being able to lock this down. But it doesn't answer all of our questions and concerns. So I've been very vocal about it up to this point, that I do have some concerns with the current configuration of the roster, because I'm not sure if Mitchell and Garland work alongside one another. I'm not sure if Mobley and Allen work together either. The reports are, though, that the Cavaliers feel confident that their new head coach hire, Kenny Atkinson, is going to be able to get the most out of this group. It is interesting. I talked about this before. When Atkinson had his most success with the Brooklyn Nets, it was balancing a number of different ball handlers, not one true, lead scorer. You could say it was D'Angelo Russell, and I believe it was the 2019 season when they were balancing him, Spencer Dinwiddie, and Karis LeVert, and all of them did have to some degree similar play styles, and ultimately that Nets team was a fun one. So there is something to look at least from that perspective, in terms of the excitement level of what Atkinson can do. Spent these past couple years in Golden State as well, where there is definitely a go-to guy, and I would say at this point that Donovan Mitchell is pretty clearly the one, but it's in terms of how can you get the most out of everybody else while still featuring the number one guy. So just, I don't know, maybe these are cliches, but just things to think about in terms of Atkinson's fit with the Cavaliers. some of the language around the reporting of this deal did catch my eye a little bit, where Woj tweeted in the same thread of the announcement of the contract extension, quote, "A significant part of Mitchell's belief in committing on a new deal comes with his confidence in Kobe Altman's vision to keep building the Cavs into a championship contender and alignment on their partnership together." So Altman is, of course, the president of basketball operations for the Cavaliers, the general manager, you could say, to some degree as well. And it sounds like Donovan Mitchell is now on board for them trying to run it back. Now, it was more so from the Darius Garland camp that Clutch Sports, who he is represented by, were potentially trying to, or were at least considering the idea of requesting a trade if Mitchell did sign an extension. That those stories came out right after the Cavaliers were eliminated from the playoffs in mid-May. It sounds like Clutch has sort of relaxed on that mindset, but we will see what happens there, because I would have to imagine Garland's trade value is tanked to some degree. I mean, there are still a number of teams out there who would take him without any hesitation, but it's not exactly, the young up-and-coming all-star value that he was a couple of years ago prior to this experiment of him and Donovan Mitchell. But I don't know. I mean, Donovan Mitchell, we saw some of the leadership moments he had during the postseason trying to pick up Darius Garland. The big three that Garland did end up hitting in, I want to say it was Game 7 of that first-round series against the Magic. So I think that Mitchell, has matured a lot throughout the course of his career, and he's somebody that I would believe in and trying to do whatever it takes to, have your roster work and operate around him. Is he a top 10 player in the NBA? He's probably on the fringe there, but still massively talented and somebody that, if you're Cleveland and you have a top 15 player commit to playing for your team, you got to make it work there, because sometimes in these mid-major or these mid-market teams, you just don't always get that. And they were able to pull it off with Donovan Mitchell. Obviously, that deal took place similar timeline to when the Hawks traded for DeJounte Murray, and Murray's already out of there. So the Cavaliers have to feel pretty good about being able to retain Mitchell, and that's a really bright sign. Now, again, maybe this was a situation where he just took the deal that could make him the maximum amount of money in the present, while also getting him closer to that contract that could make him $76 million a year. But, again, we'll see. He could have probably signed a 1-year max contract or a 2-year max contract somewhere else. He chose to be with Cleveland and try and be competitive. So it's a great sign for them. Now, again, I have some concerns here. I feel like the Cavaliers should still be at least exploring options. If I were to trade any of the 4 best players that the Cavaliers have on their roster between Darius Garland, Donovan Mitchell, Evan Mobley, or Jarrett Allen, I think you lean with one of the bigs, especially because of the fact that there are probably a number of franchises who could be in play for getting a big man. Now, obviously, I would say at least Evan Mobley has more value on the open market, so maybe that's the direction you lead. I also think that he does have the higher potential that the Cavaliers probably want to sit on and keep himself, even though he is going to be due for a rookie max contract extension as well. So, we'll see what the Cavaliers decide to do there. But especially in the Western Conference, you look at teams like the Grizzlies or the Thunder, or maybe you even want to throw the Warriors into it. Maybe you could throw the Lakers into it if Anthony Davis wants to return to playing more 4 than 5. That, there could be a number of teams that could at least be interested in a Jarrett Allen or Evan Mobley. I think that any team in the NBA could benefit from having a Jarrett Allen. Now, I don't know if that hurts or helps his value to some degree, but I would have to imagine they could get a pretty good return there. And I don't know. I mean, we'll see, obviously, how this plays out. I wouldn't blame them, I suppose, if they feel confident in what they have. They're obviously the ones who see behind the scenes there. So if there is something that they are potentially building on to make the redundancy, sort of dissipate that a little bit, then, go for it. But I just don't know if I personally see it, and I think that we could be looking at potential trade packages for somebody on the Cavaliers come the trade deadline this upcoming season. But we will see about all that. But we have some other teams to touch on here, and we're going to start with the Chicago Bulls, also in the Eastern Conference, have been sort of hovering around, I wouldn't say ever true contention, but they were hanging around playoff spots the past couple years, and they of course made the playoffs a couple seasons ago for a core that a lot of people were buying stock into, but it has been all downhill since then. We're looking at the teams, half the league turning down trade packages for Zach LaVine. So I want to dive into where the Bulls are currently at and whether or not they are finally picking a direction to go in. So we are going to dive into all of that. But first, a quick break. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast as we continue to dive through some of the storylines surrounding the NBA with free agency kicked off and such. And I want to talk about the Chicago Bulls because this has been a team that has been very frustrating the past couple of years. The fact that they understand that they are one of the more prominent brands in the NBA and that they are they have a number of players on their roster that are very talented, and they have just sort of been sitting in mediocrity the past couple of years. Now, to be fair, they made the playoffs just a couple years ago in 2022. Now, they lost in the first round in 5 games, and at that point, that's the season that the Bulls had gotten off to this hot start. They were one of the best defenses in the NBA. That's basically the last time we saw Lonzo Ball play basketball, and it was this exciting team for a number of months, but obviously health was the number one reason that we saw them end up diminishing. We saw less than ideal, you could say, Nikola Vucevic trade that ended up being Franz Wagner and other pieces as well. Patrick Williams hasn't necessarily played out to what their expectations of him were when they drafted him 4th overall in 2020, and it does seem like, this has been a long time coming where the Bulls just needed to make a move. It had been literally 2 years, maybe even 3 years. I think 2021 during that Vucevic trade and the Lowry trade were the last, player for player trades that they made up until just a couple weeks ago when they traded Alex Caruso for Josh Giddey. They were just sort of sitting on, maybe it was the value that they saw in some of their players just wasn't eye to eye with the thoughts of some of these other teams, but it was, just them hanging out in no man's land for a number of years, and they were in play-in tournaments. I always mention here, they almost beat the Heat in 2023. They had a lead with a couple minutes left in the 4th quarter, and they end up blowing that. Then the Heat go on to make the finals, so it's always this butterfly effect thing that I sort of point to. But the reality, the Bulls have just been painfully average, and if you want to go by record, they have been even a little bit worse than that the past couple years. And it now finally seems like they are picking a direction, and they probably did so too long, where there were a number of teams at the trade deadline this past year that were calling about Andre Drummond to potentially acquire him at the deadline. They also had, for whatever it's worth, DeMar DeRozan on an expiring deal where they probably could have gotten at least something for that, knowing that, teams wouldn't have to worry about the long-term commitment of him, but would maybe be willing to give up, call it even a late first-round pick, I don't know, multiple second-round picks, just anything for DeRozan. Now, that being said, the word surrounding the Bulls for a lot of that time as well was the idea that the Bulls were planning on bringing him back, which I'm glad that doesn't seem to be the case now, but they are going to probably get nothing for him. I think I saw this morning LeBron James just signed his new contract with the Lakers and took a max deal, meaning that there probably isn't the money for DeRozan there, and that the Miami Heat have emerged as the front runner, which is a little bit of an interesting fit. I don't hate it by any means, but I definitely like that idea more than DeRozan just going back to the Bulls to be this experienced player that can play winning basketball, not on a good team, and sort of getting in the way almost a little bit of the development of the younger players you could make an argument for. Now, DeRozan kept them in a lot of clutch games, which is something that probably isn't the worst thing in the world for development of these young players to have these, these big time possessions, but ultimately it was all for what? Because ultimately they end up falling out of the playoffs again, and I was just, again, very frustrated with them for a number of years, but I can finally get behind the direction of them at least a little bit. Now, I mentioned Patrick Williams and how he's been a little bit disappointing up to this point in his career, but signed a 5-year, $90 million contract extension. That sounds like a lot, but $18 million a year in today's NBA really isn't all that much, and you're getting a player who has definitely been derailed to some degree because of injuries throughout the course of his career so far. But when you're the Bulls and now finally you are understanding where they're at, now they have Vucevic and Zach LaVine on the roster as things currently stand on the books. I mean, they tried their very hardest to let LaVine go. They're going to have to probably wait until he builds up at least some semblance of stock through this regular season. But, the point being that I don't mind having a little bit of extra money invested into young players if you are a team that isn't going to win in the now. And that's kind of what this Patrick Williams contract feels like to me. They also made the move for Josh Giddey a couple weeks ago. I know that this is another move that a lot of people saw as very, as a bad deal, but I don't see it that way whatsoever for Chicago. Yes, because they're the Thunder and they seem to have this treasure chest that is of draft capital in years to come. Maybe it would have been nice to, add somebody there, but at the same time, you're talking about a young player in Giddey who has promise, is just 21 years old, in exchange for a 30-year player that was about to be on an expiring deal and isn't, a massive threat offensively, even though I love Caruso. He had one of the more efficient years of his career offensively this past year. So I also love the deal for the Thunder in that regards, especially considering Giddey just wasn't a fit, and that is something that I think a lot of people have sort of forgotten about, is the fact that Giddey was good for a period of time there. And I understand there's an argument to say that he was a good team, a good stats, bad team type of player, but I really don't see it that way. Averaged 17 points, 8 rebounds, and 7 assists in 32 games that he has played in his career without Shai Gilgeous-Alexander. So I think that he can actually set the table in a pretty decent way for his teammates. And the Bulls are still far from even having a really exciting young core, but I am just happy for them that they are picking a direction after these years of kind of playing out this string that just wasn't worth it. Because listen, they've made the playoffs once since 2018, and I got the impression, at least, that the ownership group was just kind of comfortable with being in that middle zone, knowing that in Chicago, for the Bulls, they're going to sell out just about every night. So I think the Bulls fans deserve better. And again, they still have a lot of things to work out. Next year is probably going to be a season where they're trying to sell at the deadline, get worse, and position themselves better for 2025. At least that's where I hope this goes. Now, DeMar DeRozan is still a free agent. There is a very real possibility that he could come back to Chicago. So we don't know necessarily if this is definitively where they're going, but it hasn't sounded like contract talks have been all too successful up to this point between Chicago and DeRozan. So that's where we stand there. I just wanted to sort of talk about the Bulls real quick here and maybe give them a little bit of a pat on the back if they are going to choose to actually dive into a rebuild here, but we'll still have to see how that all plays out. But another team that has sort of been almost the opposite of, they were really struggling for a number of years and then emerged onto the scene last season and now are at a weird point in their organization where they don't know if they should continue on with the rebuild or invest heavily into their core, is in the Western Conference with the Houston Rockets. And there were some reports that just came out about that they are unlikely to sign their stars from the 2021 draft class in Josh Green and Alperen Şengün to max contracts. So we are going to be diving into those reports and giving our thoughts on that. But before we do, and be taking our final break, don't go anywhere. We will be right back. Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast for our final segment of the day, where I want to talk about the Houston Rockets, who are, amid all of the contract extensions and free agency signings that are flying around the NBA, they are reportedly unlikely to offer max extensions to both Josh Green and Alperen Şengün this offseason. Both of these players were selected in the 2021 draft in the first round and have been, I would say for the most part, big hits for them. Now, Josh Green has absolutely had his ups and downs throughout the course of his career. I think he was very raw when he first came in, and last year we saw him be able to flash a little bit more of his potential down the stretch of the year. Maybe not coincidentally when Alperen Şengün went down with an injury, but I think that does also sort of play into this conversation of they are both very good talents, but is it worth them jumping the gun a little bit to hand out these contract extensions? Because I'm sure Jalen Green's camp feels like they can point to the final part of the season and say, well, look what we were just doing when we were the number one option there. We deserve max money. And Alperen Şengün, just for the fact that he's been, I would say, overall the most reliable Houston Rocket of the past 3 years. Obviously, I know the bar is maybe a little bit low there, but with Şengün, he has been sort of, and we saw he was kind of, I don't know if I would go as far to say as he was the hub of their offense last season, but they played through him a lot. And I thought that it was successful when they did, so that's great. But is he going to be able to be somebody that can play a little bit? Because you can't imagine that Alperen Şengün is going to be the number one option on a massively successful team. Now, maybe I'll end up, regretting that statement someday, but, he's still just 21 years old, so who knows? Maybe the developmental track of Şengün will be some sort of a Nikola Jokic light. I mean, that does kind of feel like, and obviously I know how outlandish of a statement that is, comparing him to, Jokic is one of the best players in NBA history, but for Şengün, he would kind of have to play a similar role there. I know everybody always makes the comparisons of Jokic, Sabonis, and Şengün all sort of playing similar roles as one another. I think that Sabonis can be a number 2 on a really good team, and maybe Şengün can find his way into playing in a team system that isn't, so much predicated on him as time goes on here. But again, I still feel like all of this to be said, I don't hate them trying to further evaluate what they have in both of these players before making this massive commitment on them. And I will say, when I first saw this report, immediately where my head went was, well, that is basically case in point as to why you don't overpay veterans like they did last offseason in Fred VanVleet and Dillon Brooks. And I thought that that was going to be the big reason why they weren't going to be able to pay either Şengün or Green this type of money. It's actually not the case. They only have $121 million on the books for next season, and the majority of that is controlled in team options. Starting with Fred VanVleet, who has a $44.9 million team option for next season that I kind of have to imagine they're going to decline. Now, we'll obviously see how this next year plays out. But again, if they were so concerned of we're absolutely all in on Josh Green and Alperen Şengün, then we can just sign these contracts, not even worry about the VanVleet number, because it will eventually be null and we'll just get rid of it. But it doesn't actually seem to be the case. And Dillon Brooks, he still has something like $40 million left on his deal over the course of 2 years. It's a descending contract, so it's going to be $21 million next year and then just under 20 in 2026-27. But that's another contract that I honestly feel like could be pretty movable if they would like to. So, they have the financial capabilities to be able to pay both of Green and Şengün. Now, it's a topic of conversation because we're seeing other people in that class get these contracts. Cade Cunningham was sort of the spark for it, where he got the deal, and then almost immediately this report came out after. So that's why it's being talked about right now. But again, they still have a lot of sort of options here moving forward, where they have other, top-end draft picks that they've taken, such as Cam Whitmore. He went to 20. That was probably a bad place to start there, but was once viewed as a top 4 or 5 prospect in his class before his fall. Amen Thompson, though, they just drafted Reed Shepherd. Tari Eason has been a really pro for them since they took him, and I'm trying to think what draft class he was in. I believe it was 2022 was when he was taken there. So, and Jabari Smith Jr., I can't believe that's the last name I mentioned out of that list. But, the point being, there's a lot of players that are going to be looking to get theirs in the coming years. And especially under this new luxury tax situation and the current collective bargaining agreement, I wouldn't want to get stuck with Josh Green or Şengün on. I don't think that either of them are ever going to be bad contracts necessarily, but there is going to be some level of they might, if they were to spend the money now, they might end up hurting themselves in the long term in terms of not being able to pay some of these younger guys and falling into a slippery situation in terms of the salary cap. So I don't hate the idea for them. It's interesting because the Rockets were also just rumored, at least according to ESPN's Adrian Wojnarowski, at least kind of kicking the tires on Kevin Durant and Devin Booker. This was few weeks ago when the Mikal Bridges to the Knicks trade first broke out. But, I'm not really sure where the Rockets are going to go from here. I believe that Ime Udoka is a very good coach and is going to help lead the Rockets to some legitimately relevant seasons in the coming years. But it's also probably going to take, some level of, I don't even know exactly what it is in terms of, they're going to have to figure out what the hierarchy is in this organization. And that's really what I'm getting at here, is they can't just fire away every contract extension at the time that it becomes available, because of the idea that they do have high ceilings and they could pan out. The Rockets feel like an organization that is trying to, yes, they've acquired all of this youth talent that they've helped to develop over the past handful of years, but what type of a team do they want to be moving forward, and who is going to be a priority in that? Because I've been a defender of Josh Green in terms of, I think he is very talented, but there is some question as to whether he can play actual winning basketball, or if he is kind of a product of just being a great individual talent who doesn't necessarily fit in with a winning culture just yet. And again, I think that he can get there. He came in through the G League Ignite, which I have expressed my discontent for a number of years, and I think that because of that, it almost sort of took him out of, what it's like to play for an actual winning culture, a program that is built on chemistry and all of that. And then he came into the Rockets and was able to put up just about however many shots he wanted to on a given night, where, let me double check right now, but yeah, he was putting up 18 shots a game on 41% from the field in his sophomore season. And last year was definitely the most promising he's been, despite that we saw his scoring dip off from the sophomore season to his third season, but I still feel like he played better basketball as a whole. But again, no guarantees with any of this. That's how the Rockets feel, and they are going to try and look to further evaluate before committing any money to either of them. So let me know whether or not you think this is the right decision for the Rockets. Again, it is a little bit of a tough decision, but I think I understand where they're coming from, absolutely. But that is all the time we have for today. Thank you very much for tuning into the GSMC Sports Podcast. Thank you to the GSMC Sports Network for allowing us to host this show. Remember to like, follow, subscribe wherever you keep up with us. To everyone else, just a reminder to check us out on social media as well for more exclusive short content. And we will be back tomorrow. We will see you then. Have a great 4th of July and take care.
Let's go. I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day. Yeah, I'm tired of shit, and the coffee ain't hit yet, damn, ain't that great.